Can I give you all a very warm welcome? If you've not already grabbed a coffee
I think it's on.
and some cake, you can welcome to do that at any point in tonight's meeting. If you don't know me, if we've not met you, my name is Andy Cole. I'm one of the ministers here at Moneyhold Church. I want to welcome you to our Big Questions meeting tonight. It's quite an informal time together, but we want to have a good opportunity just to reflect on probably the biggest question that we all face in this life. How do we make sense of the suffering in this world? And you might be not a Christian yet, and you might be asking that question, particularly of Christian faith. How can we believe in God in a world full of so much pain? Well, we're going to be thinking about that topic this evening, and hopefully it's going to be a helpful time together. Just to let you know, we've got kind of 3 parts to our evening. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Julia, my wife. She's going to do a short interview with Paul and Edry. Then Paul is going to give a talk on the topic. Then we'll have a little comfort break, grab some more cake, some more coffee. And then the third section will be a time of Q&A. If you're tech savvy, you can scan the QR code in on the screens. That will take you to a Slido page where you can submit your questions. If you're shy and you'd rather do it that way, you're welcome to do that. We will also have a roving microphone, so you can put your hand up and ask a question from the floor. So that's the basic format of our time together tonight. And our conviction really as a church is that big questions deserve thoughtful answers. And we recognize that we want to take seriously the doubts and the questions that we have. And we think there are very good answers that you can find in the Bible and in the Christian faith. I'm going to get out of the way now. I'm going to hand over to Julia. Can we give a welcome to Paul and Edry, particularly, who are going to be sharing a little bit of their story.
Okay. It is working. You're good with your mic. Fantastic. So I wasn't quite sure if everyone would be familiar, if Paul and Edry would be familiar faces. I think they probably are familiar faces to most people here at Moneyhold. You've been at Moneyhold, your connection sort of goes back 15 years or so?
Something like that.
Does it? Yeah. You worked with the church, moved away to Bath, but then couldn't keep away, came back to Birmingham area, allegedly to retire. I think Edry would question, what does retirement look like? But yes, allegedly to retire. So your connection to this area, to the Birmingham area, actually goes back a bit further than that. And so could you start off just telling us a bit about your roots, like how you both came to faith, how you met, sort of the early days, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Oh, wow, long time ago.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, we were at the same junior school together at Colmore Road in King's Heath.
Shall I take over? And we're
trying to think.
Tag.
Tag team, we are, yeah. The Mallard tag team.
So both Ed and I were born in Birmingham. I was born actually in Selly Oak, not at the hospital. I was born at home. I wanted to be near my mum, and moved away a little while to the Black Country, but then came back to King's Heath when I think we were about 6 or 7. And my story really is that we moved to Highbury Road in King's Heath, and my parents were lovely. They were really great. I love my parents to bits. But they had no Christian experience or Christian background. So people kind of think, well, you're a Christian because your parents were Christians. Well, that wasn't the case with me. And every summer they had what they called a holiday club, where they got a group of folk from the church, and they played guitars and concertinas, and they walked around the area, and all the children followed them, like the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Now, on the top of this banner, it said Kaju, which stood for come and join us. So we went off around the local park and back into the church. I mean, child protection, forget it. Just these people marching and taking your kids off into the distance. And that was the first time I ever heard about Jesus and the gospel, and Jesus died for me. And I started going to a little club. It's called the 6:15 Club on a Tuesday evening. And in the 6:15 Club, there was how do you describe it? A very lovely young lady. So I was about 8 and she was about 6. So But she was just, carry on.
Well, I came to faith. I come from a Christian family, and my sister, who is here, went to, I think she went to Sunday school, and she was full of missionary zeal. So I'm the little sister, so she came and said to me, "You've got to ask Jesus into your heart." So I knelt on my bed and asked Jesus into my heart. But
How old were you?
I was only 3. But you see, I thought it didn't really mean much to me. But when I was 12, we'd been doing the plagues at Sunday school, and I really thought, I don't want God to be angry with me. So I asked Jesus to be my saviour, take away sin and be my saviour. So that I sort of recommitted my life to the Lord when I was 12. So yeah, then we were in the same.
Well, no, I was going to say, I became a Christian when I was 12 as well. We were on camp, and you kind of think, well, if you're 12, you don't understand much. Well, I did. I really understood that I'd done things I shouldn't do, that I was a sinner, that I needed a saviour, that Jesus had died for people just like me. And on a Saturday evening, on the first night of the camp, somebody said, now, if anybody wants to become a Christian tonight, then pray this prayer. And I prayed the prayer, and then he said, look up, and I looked up. And from that moment on, about 20 years ago, that moment on, for years, I've never doubted for a moment the reality of following Jesus and the fact that he died for me. So then I got involved in the church and so on. And when I was 18 and Edry was 16, we started...
Going home.
Sorry?
Going home.
Going out, yeah. Is that what they call it? Yeah, we started. At a distance. I'd just gone off to university, and then I came back and she went to Bible college, then she came back and I went off to be a teacher down in Wiltshire. And that's kind of the way it worked out. But then we got married 45 years ago, and we've got 4 children and 9 grandchildren.
Fantastic. That was a great summary. And you started off teaching, you said, but you've been in ministry for longer than you were a teacher.
Oh, yeah, much longer. Yeah.
So in various places.
Yeah. 40 years, exactly 40 years. First of all, down in Wiltshire for 15 years, and then in Worcester for 15 years, and then here for 3 years as part of a ministry team, and then 7 or 8 years down in Bath, which was our last ministry. And then I retired 2 years ago.
Okay, so summarising over like that, life in ministry, 4 lovely children, 2 boys, 2 girls, all sounds very rosy and, life goals, tick, 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 tick. However, things haven't been easy for the 2 of you in life. Over the last 32 years, you've faced quite a number of challenges. Could you share some of the challenges that you've faced over these years?
Okay, can I just say, I became a pastor. I was called to be a pastor in a church in Wiltshire, and that's all I ever wanted to do. From the age of 14, I knew I wanted to serve God in some way. And most of all, I wanted to tell people about Jesus. So when I was called to be a pastor, that was fantastic. And for the first 10 years or so, life was absolutely brilliant. And we loved being in pastoral ministry. And we would say, hasn't God been good to us? Isn't life fantastic? Now during that time, my dad had died. He was only 60. Edry's mum had died. Her older sister had died after a life, really, of chronic illness. And Edry had gone through 2 miscarriages. So when you say it was rosy, we had a whole range of issues that had come up. But actually, we still stood back and we said, just life is great. Isn't God good? And we still say that, but then 32 years ago, when Edry became pregnant with our 4th child, Emmaus, that's when she became ill. Do you want to pick up on that and tell us?
It was...
Hold on.
It was sort of right from the start, really. It was an unusual pregnancy, and I was really violent sick. Not like pregnancy, but really violent sick. And we'd been to a Christian conference, and I had no balance. I can't remember.
We were at a Christian conference, and
I was staggering around.
Staggering around.
Like I was drunk, but I wasn't.
You need to say that, dear. That's right.
And then we came back and the doctor. I went to the doctor, and he admitted me to the hospital. he admitted me to hospital. And they thought of it as something to do with the inner ear. So they tested me with things like Meniere's disease and balance problems and all that. And they said it wasn't that. And then they tested me out and said it wasn't that. And then, you better take up the story.
Okay, then I'll take up the story. Then they decided that it was more serious. And so I remember, at this time Edry's 8 months pregnant, so she's kind of out here. And I turned up in the hospital in the ear, nose and throat. This was in Bath. And the bed was empty, so I said, where's my wife? She's in neurology. Now I didn't know anything about neurology, but it just sounded much more serious. So I made my way across, and then it really, for the next month or so, was a nightmare. Because the doctor was saying, we're not sure what this is. We needed some tests. So she had an MRI scan, which is where you push.
Oh, yeah, but you're going to, sorry.
Go on.
But you go into a tube, And I'm like 9 months pregnant by now. So, and it was the baby. I was sort of carrying the baby on the front and lying back, which is awful when you're pregnant anyway. And so I'm lying back, and they couldn't get me in the tube, so I said, oh, sorry, just push.
So they just pushed it.
So just pushing. I had to have 2 lumbar punctures, which wasn't good.
Lumbar puncture is where they take a needle and they insert it into your spine.
Horrible.
So that was dreadful. The doctor, he was a consultant, Mr. Bateman. He was, I don't think he was an atheist, but he was a bit contemptuous of the fact that I was a Christian. He would kind of say, oh, well, that's all this kind of Christian stuff, it's all nonsense. Which I guess you wouldn't get away with these days, but in those days, he did. And then he had to tell me that my wife was really seriously ill. And because she's pregnant, we don't know how this will work out. And the hints were pretty heavy. She may not survive. And at that point, I remember him kind of trying to meet me halfway. And he said, well, we don't know how this will work out, but we will trust Mother Nature. And you kind of think, well, thank you very much, a top professional telling me he's going to keep his fingers crossed or trust Mother Nature. And my response was, well, thank you very much for saying that, Doctor. I don't need to trust Mother Nature. I trust God. I trust my Father God. I know that he's in control. And that night I went back, and some of you heard this story before. I do ask your forgiveness for repeating it, but my daughter, who was at home, asked me to comb her hair. She was 5, long hair. Yeah. And so we sat on the stairs, and I'm kind of macheting away at her hair like this. And for a variety of reasons, I don't have a huge amount of experience at combing hair. Make of that what you will. But and she said, Daddy, you're hurting me. And she burst into tears. Now, that moment, I burst into tears as well, which she'd never seen before. I don't cry, but and she stopped. What's the matter? I just want Mummy back. I just want Mummy as she was. Because Edry was healthy, she was well, she was running about, all sorts of things. And I just wanted her back. And I remember going to bed that night, and I couldn't sleep. And eventually I fell asleep because I was dog-tired. And then I woke up around 4 o'clock, and I thought, I'm not going to sleep again. And I felt physically sick, and my stomach was churning, and round in my head was, look, I don't understand it. I'm supposed to be a minister. I'm supposed to understand things like this. I'm supposed to have answers, and I don't know what's going to happen. How am I going to continue in being a pastor? And what's going to happen to my wife? And if she goes, I've got to look after 3 children. Will the baby be okay? And all these things. It's always worse at 4 o'clock in the morning. Round and round and round. And then suddenly, I can't remember the exact time, suddenly one verse, actually part of a verse in the Bible came into my mind. As for God, his way is perfect. In other words, God's in control. You don't need to worry about it. You can trust God. He doesn't make mistakes. And so at that moment in time, I was filled with absolute peace. And I can't really describe it. It was just God almost coming near and kind of giving me a hug. And then I did something amazing. I went to sleep. And I slept through till late for me. I woke up at 7 o'clock. That was late for me. And I got up and went to the hospital. And I shared this with Edry. And they allowed me to take her out in a wheelchair. There was a cricket match playing, and we just stopped by watching this cricket match. And we prayed, and we said, God, we trust you. We trust that you're in this. And we want you to use this as a channel to help other people. We don't want to waste this. We don't want to be selfish about this. We don't want to be angry about this. Whatever the outcome, whatever it is, we want you to use this to help us, to help other people. And that prayer has been answered again and again and again and again for the last 32 years, because our daughter's 32, so we know exactly how long it is.
So connected to this, I understand that yesterday you went to Southport and you were speaking in Southport. So do you want to explain why you were there and how this connects with your own experience?
Yeah, why on earth would you go to Southport? Do you know where Southport is? Have you ever heard of Southport? Well, you would have heard of Southport just a few months ago, because Southport was where these 3 little girls were stabbed, and it led to the riots that took place in the country. And the whole community there has been kind of devastated, and the Christians in the churches have been devastated. And what they wanted to do was to get us to go and talk. So Edra and I went to basically do the kind of thing I'm doing now, but within a context where people are asking all sorts of questions. You know, how can God allow that? How can we believe in a God of love when things like that take place? And so that was the purpose of last night. And there was questions at the end, and some of the questions were quite difficult questions, because one of the things that I think we can say about suffering is that there aren't any easy answers. I think of suffering as a little bit like a jigsaw. I remember my nan, my gran, used to do jigsaws, and she'd finish one jigsaw, she'd do another one. And if I don't know whether you do jigsaws. What's the first thing you do when you do a jigsaw? You put the corners in. And then you maybe put the sides in. And it seems to me when we're trying to understand suffering, it's a bit like that. We can't be dogmatic, and we can't be... I mean, the worst thing you can do is actually say, you've got all the answers. I've got all this sorted. Don't worry about that. You're actually just putting some things in place, which is what I hope to do in a few minutes when we talk. But, I mean, what I haven't said about Edri is, well, I mean, she's remarkable. She's wonderful. I just say that. But what I haven't said is that it was actually identified as multiple sclerosis. Lots of people say, well, at least there's no pain with MS. Well, this is not an exaggeration, and it sounds as if it is, but it's not. For over 10 years, there hasn't been a single night when Adri hasn't woken up with severe pain. And a good night is one pain attack. And a bad night is a series where she's hardly got any sleep at all. So last night I woke up and she wasn't in the bed. She was lying flat on her back on the floor, just trying to get relief from the pain. So how on earth can that be part of the will of a God of love? And we struggle with that. And we have some answers, and we have some wonderful hopes, and we have assurances, but what we're not trying to do tonight is to say, we got it sussed. It's all sorted. We know how, we got an answer to the problem of suffering. There you go. It's not like that. In fact, the Bible is full of answers, full of questions, and we wrestle with them.
So, I mean, you've said that you've prayed that the experiences that you would have, that God would use those to help others and support others and comfort others, which I'm sure, no doubt, the Lord has over your years in ministry. From your experience, there will be others here, no doubt, some who are suffering, some who are walking alongside people who are suffering. From your experience, are there things that are definitely unhelpful to say to people? Edri's definitely nodding. Unhelpful to say to people who are going through a trial or suffering, or
Yes.
any things that are helpful?
There are. I can remember we went to one conference and we saw a couple that went in for a while, didn't we? And she said, she came over and she was chanting, it's lovely to see you. Oh, it's wonderful. Heard all about you, been praying for you, but we thought you'd be dead by now. That wasn't helpful, really. No. I do find when people talk, but they sort of stand behind the wheelchair, and I've got to sort of turn my neck and talk to them and look up at them. I mean, it's much easier if they come round the front to talk to me, so that's good. And Yeah, good things.
Can I just say, one of the other things is that there is a kind of I don't know how to describe it. There's a kind of a brand of Christianity which is very popular these days. If you ever turn onto the God channel, you can find all these things all the time. Sometimes they call it prosperity gospel, or it's whole, which is basically, if you are sick, then there's something wrong with your faith. God wants to heal you, but he can't because you don't have enough faith. Which on the surface sounds reasonable. When you actually look at it, it's totally destructive. And they'll say things like, well, maybe there's something wrong in your life. So when Edry first became ill, we had support from all sorts of people, Christians we'd never heard of before. And then we had folk who would come along and talk to us who I remember one man, he came to see me on a Saturday night. It was about 8 o'clock. He said, I've come to see you because I have a message for you from God. God has told me to. And I said, okay, what is it? And he said, and it's this. The reason your wife is ill is because there is secret sin in your preaching, in your ministry. Now, I'd ask the question, am I doing something wrong? And I come to the conclusion, I'm a sinner. I need God's grace. I need God's forgiveness every day. But there wasn't some secret sin in my life or my ministry that was causing this illness. So I said to him, look, I don't think that's true. And he said, well, I might have got it slightly wrong. Maybe the problem is your wife. Maybe it's the sin in your wife's life, which is when I hit him. No, I didn't, but I was sorely tempted because those things are incredibly unhelpful. And we've done evenings like this before. And afterwards, when people have had, when everything's finished and you still have people come up, I think you're wrong. You just need to believe a bit more. You just need to have a bit more faith. And in the end, what kind of God is that? It's a God who is like powerless. He'd love to help you, but sorry, I can't because, you just got to get your faith up to this level. So those things are very unhelpful. Things that are helpful?
Sometimes it's good when people, they're going through something, don't say anything at all. Just sit there and don't say anything. They just understand. They understand. So that's helpful. Helpful when people hold doors for us. Practical things like, with the wheelchair, that's helpful. Often people just walk to the door, don't think you're behind them, and leave the door. Now it's awkward for us. Practical things like kids texting, walking along texting, not looking where they're going, walking in the wheelchair,
Okay.
Terrible.
So those are very helpful hints, aren't they, how to deal with wheelchairs. I think it's interesting, when we were driving up to Southport, we have a Bible reading every day, and our Bible reading on our way up to Southport was about Job's comforters. If you know the story of Job is incredibly vulnerable, and he loses 3 things about which we're all vulnerable. We're all vulnerable in the area of our health. We're all vulnerable in the area of our possessions, things we own, our job, our career, and we're all vulnerable in the area of our family. I think that's the one where we feel the most vulnerability. And in swift strokes, he loses all 3. His family's killed. He becomes desperately ill. He loses all his possessions. And in the Bible reading, it told how his 3 friends came, and for a week they didn't say anything. They just sat with him and encouraged him. And then they opened their stupid mouths. And what they began to say are the things that I've said. Well, Job, it's because you must have done something wrong, Job. It's when people try and understand God's will that they often make a mistake. It's when we say, well, we don't know. What we do know is that God loves us. God's love to us is incredible. And he's proved it by sending his son to die for us. And so I remember my pastor, Mr. Coley, back at Highbury, it's not called Highbury anymore, it's called Kingsway now, which is a bit weird because that was the cinema when I was growing up. But when we were growing up, our pastor always used to say, whatever the problem is, the answer is always to go back to the cross. And I found that again and again. It's Jesus Christ crucified, which is unique on the subject of suffering. There's no other religion in the world that actually has a God who comes to earth and lives amongst us and dies for us. That's absolutely unique.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your honesty. Thank you for being willing to share your personal experience. And I think, Paul, you're going to share some more thoughts about this whole subject. So thank you very much.
There we go. There we are. Well, I kind of wrestled a little bit about what I should say, because in a sense, a lot of the things that I wanted to say have already come up in the first part. But what I thought I'd do, rather than just talking generally, is I'd just read a passage from the Bible, a short passage from the Bible, well, not quite so short, and then just speak about it for about 20 minutes. Can you listen for 20 minutes? The cake is calling. And I'm sure, are you getting a second piece of cake, is that right? Hello? Yeah, they're all saying yes, so don't rush. This is a psalm. In the middle of the Bible, right in the center there is a book called the Psalms, which are really the hymn book of Israel. But the amazing thing about the Psalms is they tell us about God and they tell us about ourselves. And the two go hand in hand. And the thing about the Psalms is that they are incredibly honest. There are 150 Psalms, and 50 of them, that's a third, deal with the whole question of why. They're called laments. And a lament is a kind of a passionate cry to God. Oh God, why? Why? And they often begin in the darkness, but they end up in the light. They take that journey from darkness to light. And that's what we've got in Psalm 56. It's called a Psalm of David when he was in trouble, when he's surrounded by his enemies, his life is in danger, and he talks about his fear, but he also talks about his faith. So let me read it to you. This is Psalm 56. Be merciful to me, my God, for my enemies are in hot pursuit. All day long they press their attack. My adversaries pursue me all day long. In their pride, many are attacking me. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust and will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? They twist my words, and their schemes are for my ruin. Verse 8, record my misery, list my tears on your scroll. Are they not in your record? Then my enemies will turn back. When I call for help, by this I will know that God is for me. In God whose word I praise, in the Lord whose word I praise, in God I trust, I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? I'm under vows to you, O God. I will present my thanks offerings to you, for you have delivered me from death and my feet from stumbling, that I may walk before God in the light of life. David is writing about a situation in which he is not in control. And one of the lessons that we learn in life is that we cannot control what happens to us. A few years ago, my wife and I were returning home from church. We were down in the West Country. It was exactly 8 o'clock because we turned on the news to listen to the 8 o'clock news, and the pips were going, and suddenly my wife screamed. Coming towards us on the wrong side of the road was another car. And I kind of swerved to avoid it, but it hit us in the side, and we twisted round, and we ended up facing in the opposite direction in a ditch, and the airbags went off, bang, bang. And then there was silence. And out of the silence, my wife said, "Are you alive?" And I said, "Yes." "Are you?" And she said, "Yes." And then she said, "You are going to get so many sermon illustrations out of this, aren't you?" And the answer is yes. We don't know what's round the corner. We don't know what's over the brow of the hill. We are not in control. I mentioned earlier I've been a minister, a pastor for 40 years. I've been a pastor for about a year, I think, and we had a dreadful tragedy in our church down in Wiltshire. There was a young couple that had their first baby born. It was a wonderful occasion, and we'd all celebrated. They brought little one to church for the first time, little boy, and everything was great. And then they had that heartbreaking tragedy of a cot death. One of the most inexplicable and painful things you can go through. And we had a funeral, and you can imagine a tiny little coffin, just heartbreaking. About 3 months later, the man phoned me up. I remember it was an evening. It was about 10 o'clock. It was a bitterly cold evening. And he said, look, can you come and talk to my wife? She's just don't know how to cope. And I can remember, do you remember when you had to try and get your lock open in your car to get into and you used to have to blow on it or get hot water on it just to get into the car? I remember doing that. And all the time just saying, what am I going to say to her? What am I going to say to her? Now I arrived, and when I went in, she said, Pastor, you're going to want to throw me out of the church. The things that I'm thinking, they're just so terrible. I said, well, tell me, what are you thinking? And she said, well, I'm just thinking of my little boy in that grave up on that cold hillside. And he's my little boy. I only knew him for a few months, but I love him. And I want to go up there. I want to get a blanket. And I want to put it over the grave to keep him warm. And I know it's stupid. And I know he's with Jesus, but I can't get it out of my mind. You're going to throw me out of the church, aren't you, Pastor? I said, no, I'm going to hug you and pray with you. And I don't know I can say much to you. That couple moved on, and they had lots of children. Well, 3, I think. Can't remember. And life has gone on, and they've lived through it. But that scar has remained in their lives for the whole of their lives. C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia stories, says some suffering is like, it's like if you have an appendix out. You lose an appendix, what happens? Well, you've got a scar. And it might pull a little bit, but it's just there. All you can see is a scar. But imagine you lose a leg where your whole life has changed. You know, sometimes you get phantom pain. Sometimes you get up in the middle of the night and you forget and you fall flat on your face. Your life has changed. It's always there. And that tragedy is always there in their lives. That's something they have to learn to cope with for the whole of their lives. They will limp. So what I'm trying to say, I think, is that suffering is not a peripheral thing. Suffering is so painful, so deep-seated, that for many people, this is the one thing more than anything else that either stops them coming to faith or actually destroys their faith when it's beginning. How can I believe in God in those kind of circumstances? Well, when David wrote this psalm, he was being crushed by his circumstances. And yet as he writes the psalm, he says 2 things. The first thing is that he's incredibly honest. This is a psalm of humble and honest confession. He says, God, I don't know what to do. If you look through the words, and you can maybe look at it when you get home, he says things like, Lord, I need your mercy. My enemies are all around me. I don't know what to do. Why is this happening to me? How come I'm in this situation? How come these things I don't understand. I've been trying to obey you, and then these things have happened. Why, God? Why, God? Why, God? And as I said a moment ago, there are 50 psalms that ask that question. And most of the psalms come to some conclusion out of the darkness into the light, but there are 1 or 2 where even at the end of the psalm he said, I don't understand. And we have to approach this subject with real humility. Remember what I said a moment ago? It's like just putting a few pieces on a jigsaw. But anybody who tells you they've sussed it, well, they're misleading you. So if you're not yet a Christian, and you're kind of thinking about, well, how do I get my mind around this? Let me say at least one thing. When God made the world, it was beautiful. And it's still beautiful, isn't it? We live in a wonderful world, don't you think? Hello? Yeah, we do. A few years ago, I think it was our 25th anniversary, I took my wife to just on the edge of Mont Blanc, and we were in a chalet, and I got up early in the morning. The sun hadn't risen yet, and I sat there waiting to see the sunrise, and suddenly the sun comes up, and it catches the ice on the top of the mountain, and I was just thought, wow, we live in a beautiful world, and yet we live in a broken world. A world that is badly damaged. And we live in lives that are badly damaged. This world, for all its beauty, is not as God made it. It says at the beginning of the Bible, God made everything out of nothing by the power of his word. He made it beautiful. He looked at the world he'd made and he said, it is good, it is good. It's very, very good. And then things went wrong. And part of the things that went wrong, actually the cause of what went wrong is us. The creatures who are made by God have rebelled against their Creator. And so much of the suffering in the world that we see around us ultimately is down to the fact that we who were made to know God have deliberately turned our backs on God. I don't know whether you've ever seen the film Good Morning Vietnam. Anybody seen that film? Are Christians allowed to watch that film? I don't know. Well, I watched it for research purposes. But there's a moment in that film where they have Louis Armstrong singing "What a Beautiful World" or "What a Wonderful World." Do you know Louis Armstrong? And I say to myself, "What a wonderful world." Okay, you remember that? And it's played against the background of the Vietnam War. So you got Louis Armstrong singing with his amazing voice, and the bombs are dropping on villages. And the napalm is burning out the forest, and this little girl, very famous picture, is running and she's on fire. Her clothes are on fire. And it's kind of saying, "Oh, what a wonderful world, and what have we done to it?" The world is broken. David in the Psalm says, "Look, my enemies are around me." And a lot of the suffering is just sort of incidental, but then a lot of the suffering in the world is down to us. It's down to me and you, and we're living our lives very often outside of what God wants us to do and how we want to live. And this psalm is a psalm of honest confession. He's saying, look, there are lots of things that are wrong, and actually the wrongest thing of all is me. I've done things that are wrong. But then the second thing about this psalm is it's a psalm of confidence, of humble confidence, of honest confidence in God. There are two things he says about God in this psalm that have helped me all the way through. The first thing he says is, I'm in God's hands. When I'm afraid, I will trust in God. What can man do to me? And you might say, well, there are lots of things that man can do. But David said, in the end, I know I'm in God's hands. God doesn't make mistakes. God is in control. God knows what he's doing. And I can trust him completely. During the whole time that my wife and I have been struggling with her illness, for 32 years she's been in a wheelchair. For 32 years there have been disappointments and discouragements. And I tell you what is really disappointing. When she was in her 40s and she's in a wheelchair and we're going over the park and we're sitting there and these healthy 60-year-olds run by jogging away. I want to trip them up. You know, how dare you at 60 and 70 be healthy when my wife hasn't walked for all these years? And you know, that's a natural human reaction. But can I say, for the whole of the time, the one thing that has brought us immense confidence is to know that we're in God's hands. God doesn't make mistakes. As for God, his way is perfect. And we can't understand that. We can't see how that fits together. It's mysterious. And I don't pretend to understand it. Some years ago, my daughter wanted to have a pet. And we got 4 kids, so what do you need a pet for when you got 4 kids? So we went through dog, you can't have a dog. Went through cat, never. And so she settled on a hamster. And so I said, well, you can have a hamster, but this is the condition. You have to give it the name that I choose. And if you do that, you can have a hamster. So she said, all right, Daddy, what now? I said, it's a name in the Bible. It's one of the sons of Isaiah. I'd like you to call your hamster Meher Shalal Hashbaz. And so she looked at her mother, and her mother rolled her eyes, and she got a hamster, and guess what she called it? Twinkle. So that was the end of my parental authority, okay? But little Twinkle, eventually he got out of his cage, and he disappeared under the floorboards. Somewhere in Worcester there are the bones of a much-loved but ill-named hamster. But his whole little world was that cage. That was his world. He went round on a wheel. Somebody fed him and somebody gave him to drink, and that was it. That was his whole story. And what did he know beyond the cage? Well, you know, don't go under the floorboards, you know. What did he? Nothing. He didn't know anything about my life. He didn't know anything about politics or geography or history, none of those things. And yet, compared with God's mind, we're like the hamster in the cage. God is infinite. He makes billions of stars, billions of galaxies. He holds them all together. He's a God of infinite power, majesty and might. He's got plans and purposes that are invincible. He really is in control. And if we can't understand why he's in control and what he's doing, well, that's okay. The greatest moment of human rebellion, and the greatest moment when it looked as if God's plan had failed, was when God's son Jesus died on the cross. If you'd been there on that day and you'd looked at it and you think, well, that's what a disaster. That is the greatest defeat you can imagine in the plan of God. God loves us. He sends his son to die for us, sends his son to live for us, and Jesus dies. Wicked men nail him to a cross. And yet that was the very plan of God. Because Jesus is dying to deal with that problem of sin, which is at the basis of all the suffering in the world. Jesus is dying to put things right. We can trust God's purposes. We may not understand them. And the thing that Edri and I have discovered, and it doesn't mean that there aren't times when we question it and we say, why, Lord? But we know that we trust God. That's the first thing David says. I'm in God's hands. But the second thing that David says, and this to me is quite remarkable, he says, you record my tears on your scroll. In other words, he's not only in God's hands, he's on God's heart. When he weeps, when he suffers, God knows what he's doing and knows what he's going through. Tears are very personal, aren't they? And when you cry, I told the story of my tears. When you cry, that often shows much about your heart. I think we have a picture from the guys at the back. I want to introduce you to someone. We got that picture coming up? It'll be there in a minute. There he is. That's Abraham. That's my grandson, Abraham. He's a little Welsh boy. He's in Barry. He's now actually, he's actually 8 years old, I think. He's 8, 6? He's 7, thank you. How would I know? How would I know? And he's lovely. He's just, his older sisters call him the Golden Prince. And your little Abraham was born with the most severe difficulties. He has a rare condition. There's a Latin name for it, but basically means smooth brain. You know, your brain looks like a walnut. His brain never developed after about 14 weeks or so, which means that when he was born without any of the higher functions. He couldn't do what a newborn baby could do now. Newborn baby can do more than Abraham can. So he can't see and he can't hear, and he can't feed himself, can't recognize people, he'll never walk. It's tragic. It's heartbreaking. He has such severe epileptic fits that his bones break. 3 times he's broken his bones. It is utterly heartbreaking. And, you know, we talked about suffering. For us, for my wife and myself, I think for our family, that has been the most tragic thing that we've ever had to go through. Nothing compares with that, really, because here's this little life. And when he was first diagnosed, we went to see my daughter, who lives in South Wales, and we sat with her, and she began to cry. And I'd said all sorts of things, you know, I don't think they were very sensible, so I just tried to say something. And my daughter began to cry, and then my wife sat next to her, and she just put her arms around her. And for the next 15 minutes, they both wept, and wept, and wept. I think it was the most therapeutic thing that happened that evening. And if you'd collected all those tears, well, there'd be quite a few of them. And the psalmist, in this remarkable statement, he said, God records our tears. He remembers. God is not infinite and far out there and unconcerned. He's infinite and he's personal. He's powerful and he's loving. He's immensely gracious, because this God hasn't just made the world, he's entered into the world he's made. God became a man and dwelt amongst us. You know, it's not far from Christmas, is it? Let me remind you. What do we remember at Christmas? God became a man. He lived amongst us. He knows what it is to go through the things we go through. He's tasted. He was human in every single way, like us, except he never did wrong. He experienced rejection and loneliness and disappointment and discouragement. He experienced torture. He experienced death. And he died. And God is saying, when you have a problem about suffering, look at my son. Look at the cross. Here is a God who knows. Here is a God who cares. Don't always explain things, but we can trust him. Right at the end of the psalm, David says, and the time will come when I will declare in your presence, and I will walk in light, and I will come free. David's hope is that beyond all his suffering, there is something more. In his case, he did walk free from his enemies. He became king. It was great. But God doesn't promise us that we escape from our suffering. I would love to see my wife healed. People have prayed for that. I'd pray for it. I would love to see her running again, and that would just be remarkable. I wouldn't be able to catch up with her, That would be great. But we know that ultimately, one day, she will be made well. The Bible tells us that Jesus died. 3 days later, he rose from the dead. His resurrection was real. It's a matter of history. It's a matter of fact. You can check it out for yourself. And it changed everything. Death is not the end. There is hope in the future because Christ is risen. If you take all the pain and suffering in this world, and you've got, the old-fashioned scales you used to use in the kitchen. Do you remember those things? Do people still use that these days? In the one side of the scale pan, you put all the pain, all the suffering, all the heartbreak of this world, everything we go through. And it's immense. It's huge. And into the other scale pan, you put a moment in heaven when we see Jesus, when we have a new body without pain, without suffering, and we have a relief from all the sorrows of this world. And you know what happens? Down goes the other scale pan. Paul puts it like this in the Bible: these light and momentary trials are preparing for us an eternal weight of glory. People would say to us, that's just wishful thinking. No, it's not. We have a real hope, which is based on a fact of history, that Jesus rose from the dead. One day my wife will run again. One day she'll be able to dance. She watches this dreadful program on a Saturday night. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's awful. It's my chance to go to bed. But she used to as a girl, she used to bop. Is that the word? Bop? To a band you've never heard of before. They were called ABBA. Have you ever heard of them? And she would love to, and she'd love to do it again. But one day she would be able to do that, because the Bible speaks of a resurrection of the body. All that we are and all that we could be. And we're convinced, and not everybody agrees with this, but we're convinced that one day when we get to heaven, this stunningly young man with a shock of blonde hair will come across to us and he'll say, hello, Grandad, hello, Granny, I'm Abraham. And we know it's Abraham because he'll have a Welsh accent. But nobody's perfect, are they? So, what is at the heart of the Christian faith? I hope you've seen it's Jesus. God comes to earth, he knows our suffering. He suffers to put it right. He rises from the dead, and one day he will come again and deal with all those things. So that's my talk. It wasn't too long, I hope. The cake's call, and then I think after that there's the opportunity for questions. Okay.
5 minutes or so, comfort break, grab a bit more cake, and then we'll have some questions and answers. Great, thank you. Can I encourage you to get back to your seats if you're wandering, getting a drink or a cake? Thank you. So it's been such a great time so far. Thank you so much, Paul and Edry, for what you've shared, and Paul, for what you've just been sharing with us. So we want to have an opportunity now just for some questions. Whether we'll have answers, whether Paul has all the right answers, he's already said there are no easy answers to a lot of this, is there? But we want to have some time just to reflect together. We've got a few questions that have popped up on the Slido. Do feel free to post others if you've got burning questions you'd like us to chat about, then please do use the Slido. But we do have a roving mic as well. John, do you want to stand up, John? John's got the microphone over there. So I'm going to sit down. Can I just open it out, first of all, just open to the floor? Does anyone want to ask a question from the floor? And John will come and find you with the microphone. Any brave souls? Everyone's very shy tonight.
Can I ask you a question? On a Saturday night, does your wife watch Strictly?
Unfortunately, yes.
So you're not a fan either?
There's not many things I hate in life, but I think Strictly is one of them.
There you go. There you go.
Sorry if that's offensive, but yeah, it's
There you are.
yes.
You just alienated half your congregation.
I'm
You do
sorry.
realise that, don't you? But there we go. There we go. Okay, question over.
What would you say to people who say, well, if God, we understand the fall and why bad things happen in the world because of the fall, but if God knew that and he knew that he was going to remedy it with Christ and the cross, but why did there have to be so much suffering in between? And then since then, why couldn't he have done it quicker and reduced all the suffering that's gone on?
Why couldn't God have done things quicker and reduced all the suffering? That's one of those questions that I just have to say I can't answer. I think that comes down to things I've tried to stress are that there are three things we know about God. And we must never step back for any of those three things. Number one, God really is in control, that there aren't accidents, that when something bad happens, it hasn't come under God's radar. It's not as if, well, if only I'd been in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve wouldn't have sinned. No, God's in control. Number two, God is full of love. He's good, and he's good all the way through. God cannot do anything that's not good. He's incapable of bad things. And number three, he's wise. And that's the one that we kind of struggle over because of our limited understanding. So when my daughter Emmaus, who is the 32-year-old now, I remember one Christmas we used to have an open fire, a real fire. And she loved it. She'd never seen an open fire before, so she was very small. She'd crawl across, and she wanted to grab one of the coals because they looked so beautiful. And she'd crawl across, and we'd put something in the way, and she'd crawl across again. And in the end, I had to take her aside and tell her very sharply, and sharply enough to burst into tears. And at that moment in time, she must have thought her dad was an absolute monster. What a terrible... all I want to do is touch this beautiful coal. It's, well, I know better than that, as do you. You don't put live coal into the hands of a child. But she didn't understand that her experience was so limited. And our experience of reality is so small. Why so many deaths? So much suffering? Why? And the answer, I don't think the Bible tries to give an answer, except that in the end, we will see that God did all things well and that God will have glory. And we're not pawns. We're not like little bits on a chessboard that God moves around and he doesn't care. The whole point of the Christian faith is that God cares so much that he enters into the world he's made. So that's not really an answer. That's simply trying to get away from a question I can't answer. I don't think the Bible answers it, and I don't know if any theologians ever come up with a good answer either.
Thank you.
What I thought was very interesting was when you said about there's always a scar when you've had a bereavement or some sadness in your life. And sometimes you feel you should be able to dismiss these things because they've happened and God's been with you, but it's always there. And it's quite all right to feel like that you can remember these things with sadness and not feel guilty about it.
Absolutely. I mean, when the Bible says that one day he will wipe all tears from our eyes, the suggestion there is that actually in this life there will be tears. The way which I've sometimes put it is like this. I find this helpful. If you take the first 2 chapters of the Bible, Genesis 1 and 2, the Bible says that God made a world. The world was perfect. We've been, on a Sunday morning, we've been looking at the Garden of Eden. It would have been great to be in the Garden of Eden. Can you imagine that? With a perfect relationship and a perfect body and no sickness, no pain, no suffering, no death. And the last 2 chapters of the Bible are the same. Revelation 21 and 22, no sickness, no suffering, they will never weep again, all of those things. It's kind of Eden restored, but better, because there was a way out of Eden, but when we get to heaven, there'll be no way out. But we live there in the middle of the book. That's where we live. That's our experience. And it's interesting. I mean, how far are we going in Genesis? Genesis chapter
3.
Chapter 3. Well, we get to Genesis 3 and you see where it all goes haywire. If you read on the next chapter, Genesis 4, you get violence and murder in the world in the first place. So you're absolutely right to feel guilty because we suffer. Take bereavement. You know, you lose a loved one and Christians say, oh, well, you know, you got over it by now. You're married to someone for years and they're gone. You reach out in the bed in the morning when you wake up and you're half asleep and you expect them to be there and you know they're gone. You're not going to say, well, of course you grieve. The Bible says we grieve as people in the world. We don't grieve like people in the world, but we do grieve. So we need to be more sympathetic to one another. And that really, if I can say this as well, that's why God puts us in churches with family who can support us and love us. And we need one another.
Yeah, thank you. I'll do one from Slido. Paul, you spoke, and Edri, as you were sharing about your particular story, you spoke about having obviously great grief and sorrow, and yet joy in God in the midst of that. Now that might sound very strange and foreign to someone who doesn't know God, doesn't have faith. Can you just explain that a little bit? How you can be deeply hurting and yet rejoicing at the same time?
Well, it depends how you define joy. First thing to say is that the Christian life is full of joy. People say, well, no, being a Christian must be very miserable. You know, you can't do this and you can't do that and you can't do the other. And, you got to go to church on a Sunday. And it's immensely joyful. When you come to know God, you come to realize the reason you were born. So number one, it's full of joy. Number two, what does joy mean? Joy isn't a passing emotion. You know, West Brom win on a Saturday afternoon, you got joy. If they draw with Oxford, of all places, you are devastated, okay? So that's just passing emotions. That just goes up and down. That doesn't last. But there is something that is deeper than that, which isn't emotional, it's not temperamental, and it's not even circumstantial. You can have joy in your heart while you've got tears in your eyes, because I think joy in the end is a deep-seated peace and confidence that God knows what he's doing and he's not making mistakes. So yes, and what you were saying earlier, yes, I weep and I grieve and this breaks my heart, and sometimes we look at our little grandson and it breaks our hearts still, all that he might have been. And we get a phone call from my daughter, and he's in hospital again. He's just had he's just broken one of his bones. Last year, his life expectancy is probably about 12, 13. Last year he was in hospital and he survived, but we thought he wasn't going to. And my daughter said, well, what happened this year is a rehearsal. One day we won't come out of hospital. That breaks our hearts. And at the same time we have a deep-seated joy because we know that God is with us and we have great hope for him. And so you can have joy, real joy, which is not circumstantial or emotional or temperamental, but which is just a deep-seated knowing that it is well because God is with us.
Thank you. Another question from Slido, Paul. You spoke in your talk about how sometimes it's the moment of great suffering and grief that leads someone to reject God, reject the whole idea of God, or even maybe they had a faith, but the moment something tragic happens, it causes them to turn away from God. So suffering clearly for some people does that. It turns people from faith. Do you think that God can use suffering to draw people to himself?
I certainly can. I mean, C.S. Lewis describes suffering as God's megaphone. You know, he'll talk to us, but sometimes he has to put the megaphone. Last week, I did a funeral for one of our best friends. And we went on holiday. He was in our church in Chippenham, in Wiltshire. We went on holiday, and he had 2 sons. And his oldest son, when he grew up, completely rejected the Christian faith. Completely rejected it. And not just rejected it, he kind of got into drugs and to so many different... And he went to the Far East, to the Philippines, and then to the... And he was caught in that tsunami. Do you remember the Boxing Day tsunami? And he was caught in that. And he was in a hotel, and he says that as the water was rising, there was just a little window, and he got his head by the window, and if the water had gone any higher, that would have been the end of him. And so he's there grabbing breath through the window, and he cries to God, God, have mercy on me. He'd been brought up in a home to know the gospel. Have mercy on me. And then he survived, came back to England and forgot all about it. Not interested. You know, that was an accident. And then he was in a motorbike accident, which almost killed him, and he thought, there won't be a third time. And so he became a Christian. And he met a Christian girl. He now works full-time for Operation Mobilization. He's on one of their ships that travel around the world telling people about Jesus. Now, in his case, I remember his mum and dad saying to me, if Paul ever becomes a Christian, it will take something quite remarkable. Well, it took a lot to get him there, but it did. And so sometimes God uses suffering to get our attention. And I'm glad that he doesn't do that all the time, but you know, people look back and they say, God was in that. God was in control. Can I say this? And I mean, this sounds really difficult. Last Sunday, I was in a church in Worcester, my old church, and there's a young lady there who was one of my students. And in January, she became ill. She's in her 30s, I guess, got one child. She became ill in January. She was very, very sick in February and March. By April, she was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Cancer in her bones, cancer in her brain, everywhere. And she gave this recorded interview. It was an amazing interview. And in the middle of the interview, she said something I'll never forget. She said, cancer is a horrible thing, but there's one thing that is worse than cancer, and that's sin. And I rejoice that I have been forgiven. And I have hope. And I know I'm going to heaven. And Jesus died to deal with my sin. And sin is 1,000,000 times worse than cancer. And cancer may not be healed, but sin can be forgiven. And it was one of those moving moments. In fact, if you go to Wood Green Evangelical Church, you can probably see the interview that she did. It was a recorded interview because at this point she's barely able to speak very much. And it just came to me that actually in this world in which we live, what's the most important thing for any of us is to have a relationship with God. And whatever we go through in life, it's if it gets us to that point where we cry out for mercy and come to know God, then that's the most important thing of all. More important than anything else.
Thank you. There's a few more questions on Slido, but can I open it back out to the floor? Any other questions from the floor that we've got the roving mic for? Is that a hand? Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, it just strikes me as we get older, you know, we can face many health difficulties, and that can affect our ability to worship God and to enjoy Him. What advice would you give those who, you know, maybe a bit older and facing those health difficulties, you know, as they go through that and they suffer and in their Christian life? What sort of things practically would you encourage people with and encourage them to do?
Well, that's a good question coming from you, Louis. You can begin to see that you're struggling a little bit with things. I think the most important thing to realise is that in the end, it's not our gripping God that matters, it's God's grip on our lives. And he grips us through all our experiences. And as I look back, what has kept us going? It's been God's grace. It's the promises that he made, I will never leave you nor forsake you. And we haven't always been up to it, but he has. So what happens when you become old? Well, you do lose your faculties. I mean, you can't do what you used to do. My best friend died last year, or this year actually, and he was a businessman. He was one of my elders in my first church. He was absolutely brilliant. Everything he touched turned to gold. He made a lot of money, and he gave so much away to Christian mission. Ever I wanted someone's advice, I would go and see him. In the last 3 years, he had Alzheimer's. And his daughter said to me, it's brutal. Dad, who was the life and soul of the party, is now like a ghost at the table. And yet the point was that although in some ways he couldn't do what he used to do, his mind wasn't clear, throughout all that, he still knew that Jesus loved him. And he would always pray in the prayer meeting. Sometimes he would just pray, Lord, I don't know what to say, but thank you for loving me. So I think the thing to do, as we get older, as life gets more difficult, just to realise that we often put it down to performance. If I can do this, God will love me. It's not performance. We want to please God, but we do for God what we can within the abilities that we've got, within our faculties. And in the end, it's not my grip on God, it's his grip on me. I will never leave you, I will never forsake you, I will keep you. And into old age, I will keep you. And I think, I suppose dementia has become a huge thing in lots of people's lives these days. And if it's not dementia, it's physical disability. But God keeps us through those things as well. So I think, where is our faith? Where is our trust? I'm in the hands of God. I'm in the heart of God. He won't let me go.
Thank you. I've got a couple more on here. I can imagine this might be a question that someone who's newer to the Bible, newer to the Christian faith, as they start to hear the story of the Bible unfold. Satan is a very real person in the Bible, and it's kind of an age-old question, isn't it? If Satan has caused so much evil and harm in the world, why did God allow Satan?
It's like the first question, really. Why did God allow suffering? Why did God allow Adam and Eve to sin? And I'm not sure that there's an easy answer to that. I think what the Bible does is it says two things. And we were talking about this in our focus group. We did the doctrine of God. So I could call one or two of the focus group to come and answer that, but I won't, because that would be too much jumping on them. But two things that we thought about. On the one hand, the Bible puts a huge amount of stress on our personal responsibility, human responsibility, and the devil's responsibility. The devil is a power of evil in the world. Things happen that you think, well, there's something behind that, and we are responsible for our actions, and we make real decisions. We're not puppets. We're not kind of pieces on a chessboard. It's not that God moves us where he wants to move us. We make real decisions that make a difference for time and eternity. And the Bible teaches that. We are responsible for what we do. And at the same time, God's in control. God controls all things. God knows what he's doing. And nothing happens without God's permission. So you talk about the story of Job. Part of the story of Job is that the devil wants to destroy Job. He wants to say to God, God, this man loves you because he's wealthy and he's happy and he's healthy and he's got a big family. If he lost everything, then his life would fall apart. And he would curse you. He wouldn't believe in you anymore. And God says, I know he'll continue to believe me. I know that whatever happens, he'll trust me. And it's almost as if the devil puts the bullets in the gun. And in the end, God sets the limits. He says to the devil, you can do this and you can do that, but you can't touch his body. And eventually God says to the devil, you can make him ill, but you can't kill him because I'm in control. Martin Luther said in the book of Job, the devil is only God's devil. He can only do what God allows. So the comfort of knowing that in the end, God's in control is wonderful, and the devil can't destroy me. God's bigger than the devil. The devil's just a servant of, a creature. But then at the same time, I'm responsible for what I do. I'm responsible for my actions. My actions count. And those two things are held together in the Bible, and it never tries to explain how they fit. They're just both true.
Thank you. Can I combine a couple of questions here? This is really sort of asking about sort of particular verses or particular books in the Bible. Are there any verses that you could share that give hope? You mentioned, the loss of a newborn child, or perhaps for people who are not capable of understanding the Bible and the gospel. Are there any verses that give us hope that they'll be with us in eternity?
There are a number of things that I'd turn to, and there are a number of books you can get on the market. There was a book written by Spurgeon, who's a great preacher, book written by a man called John MacArthur, who deals with that issue about children who die in infancy. Where I always go back to is where David loses a baby, a child dies. And up until the moment that the child is still alive and there's still hope, he grieves, he prays, he tears his robe. When he hears that the baby's gone, he gets up and he washes and he gets dressed and he has a meal. And they say, you were grieving when he was... But he said, now... And then he says something amazing. He won't come to me, but I will go to him. I will go to him. And some people say, it just means baby's dead, I'm going to die as well. I don't think it means that. If you look at the book of Psalms, many of the Psalms are written by David. David had a very real hope and expectation of life beyond this life. He didn't, when he talked about, where I will go after death, he isn't just saying I'm going to be in the grave and that's the end of it. He had a real expectation that he would be in God's presence, where there is fullness of joy. So when he says that child has gone there and I will go as well, that's what I think. And there are other verses that I would point to, but babies are not innocent because we're all sinners. Even when a child hasn't done something wrong, there's still original sin. But I don't believe that's the thing. I mean, it's not, they're innocent, so they'll be okay. It's a bit more complicated than that. But I do believe there's enough verses to give us hope in that way. And I could talk to you afterwards about that if you wanted me to. But that's what gives us hope.
Thank you. Can I give one more opportunity for any questions from the floor before we wrap up with one more from Slido over there?
Well, I know I'm guilty of this one, but why as Christians do we blame God for suffering?
Why do we blame God for suffering? Well, I guess because in the end, we know that God's in control. And as far as my wife is concerned, as far as Edra is concerned, she could have gone through life without MS. And so why does God allow that? Why does God... So I think it's because of what we believe. See, if I'm an atheist, Richard Dawkins, who is the kind of premier atheist, he doesn't have a problem suffering. There's this question where someone asks him, my daughter died. What hope can you give me? He said, what are you talking about? There's no hope. And what's the meaning? There is no meaning. We're just, we're an accident. So if you don't believe in God at all, then it's not a problem. It's no problem. And in that sense, atheism is a comfortable position because it's not. Because deep down inside, we know there's got to be more to life than this. When I stood at my dad's graveside, he died at 60. I knew I was going to see him again because he was a Christian. But I remember thinking there as I stood at the graveside, even if I wasn't a Christian, even if I didn't have all the beliefs I had, I would still have something inside me saying, this isn't the end. There is hope beyond this. Something inside us cries out and says there's got to be more. So then if we do believe in God, then we have a bit of a problem. Because if God is in control, why does he allow it? And so I think that's the reason we blame God, because we know God and we know that he's kind and he's loving and he's good all the way through. So what's the mystery of it? And I can't get it.
Thank you. Okay, well, time's nearly gone. I'll ask just one more question from Slido, but please feel free. I'm sure Paul and Edry will be around for a few more minutes at the end. Come and chat to them. But just to finish with Paul, someone's asked a question, particularly in terms of someone who's living the life of faith and walking with God. what would you say to someone if they're trying to understand why God has allowed suffering in their life? I think the question is alluding to a verse in Romans where it says God works for the good, works through all things for the good of those who love him. Do you think it's always possible for us to know why God has allowed particular suffering in our life, and what the good is that he's doing?
Okay. It's one of those situations where I guess if they'd come to your focus group, they'd have learned that you never take a verse out of context. Is that,
Yes.
is that right, pretty much? And when it says in Romans 8:28, God works all things together for good, that's a great statement. It's a wonderful comfort. And it's one of those verses that we often twist because we say, yeah, that's true, except in my situation. God works all things for good, except this, or except that, or except the other. God works all things for good. And then we say, well, what does that mean? I'm going to have a pain-free life. What it says in the next verse is that God's purpose is to transform us to be like Jesus, to be like his Son. So in other words, the good is not comfort and ease in this life. It's being made like Jesus. It's being like Christ. And how did Christ develop what went in the life of Jesus? Jesus suffered. He suffered more than anybody. In fact, he was known as a man of sorrows. He was a man of joy. He was a man of sorrows. So what's God doing in that suffering? He's working in our lives to transform us. One illustration I once heard there was a sculptor, and he was brilliant at taking a block of wood and sculpting a horse. Couldn't do anything else except for horses, but when he'd done the horse, it looked as if it was alive and would jump off the table. He'd take the block, he'd take his scalpel, his knife, and he'd cut away and cut away and cut away. And somebody once asked him, what's your technique? What do you do? And he said, I don't know really. I look at the block of wood, and I see the horse in the block of wood, and then with my knife, I cut away everything that isn't horse. In other words, I get rid of it, and in the end, the horse is there. Now, God looks at our lives, if we're Christians, and he wants to make us like Jesus. And so sometimes he has to cut things away. Sometimes he has to remove things. Sometimes things that we even cherish are removed so that we can grow in faith, and we can grow in strength, and we can grow in love, and we can grow in... And I would say that our lives have been transformed through Edry's illness. The prayer that we prayed, make us a channel. I mean, part of the answer is we're sitting here tonight talking about it. Because, in a sense, God has taught us those lessons. So nothing is wasted. Suffering can make you bitter, or it can make you better, and you make the choice. And you trust God's resources. And it isn't easy, but God knows what he's doing.
Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you, Edry, as well, for sharing tonight. Before we wrap up, can I just highlight 4 brief things for you? You'll see on the tables, hopefully, there's a number of different postcards and flyers. I'm not going to mention everything, but can I just let you know we've got a remembrance service coming up on Sunday, the 10th of November. That'll be starting at 10 to 11, slightly earlier time. If you're around, we'd love you to join us for that remembrance service and bring along friends as well. A bit later, on Saturday, the 16th of November, here at the church, we've got a women's breakfast. There's postcards advertising that, and it's looking at finding strength in the midst of suffering. So you're very welcome to sign up on the QR code on that card.
If you're a woman.
Well. Yeah, if you're a woman, obviously. And also, just to let you know, our Christmas flyers are out on the table. Hopefully you'll see some postcards here with our Christmas events and services. I won't go through all of them, but do please take one of those away with you. And we'd love you to come along and join with us. And finally, can I just highlight, there's a yellow banner. You can see it behind me here at the back. There's another one right at the back of the church. We're running a fairly new course that's come out recently called 321 in January. And there's a QR code on the banners. You can scan that in. That'll take you to our website, and that'll tell you a bit more about the course. And if you're interested, you can sign up for the course. And it's an informal opportunity to dig a bit deeper into finding out what the Christian faith is all about, and look at the Bible for yourself. So I'd encourage you to come along to that, to bring friends along. That would be great. But thanks once again for tonight, for coming. We hope it's been helpful. And follow us on Instagram and look out for future big questions. We'll be doing one hopefully next term. But thank you again for coming tonight. Thank you.